forum's theme of trust in science. We're going to focus specifically this morning on trust in science with respect to bridging the gap between evidence-informed policy and decision-making. Trust is fundamental to the conduct of science. Sir Peter Gluckman last night said at the opening ceremony that if science is not trusted, it will not be used. The erosion of trust in science and in institutions more broadly requires urgent and collective action. This is no easy task. The complexities of considering and negotiating different viewpoints and positions from scientific, social, economic, environmental, and political communities is considerable, to say the least. Our excellent panel of speakers have taken on the challenge of exploring some of the complexities involved in the practical steps required to facilitate this science policy society dialogue. They are all going to speak to what they think is currently creating the biggest gap between science, society, and policymakers in crafting evidence-informed policy and its uptake in decision-making. So, let us begin with our first speaker. Oh, in the meantime, I'm forgetting this. There's the agenda, our discussion, speakers, then hopefully we'll have time for a plenary discussion and a Q&A and a sum up. And my name is Vivi Stavru from the International Science Council. And our first speaker will be Dr. Gustavo Merino. Gustavo is Director for Social Policies, UNESCO Social and Human Sciences Sector. Gustavo, at a time when scientific evidence is crucial for addressing global crises, is trust in science today where it should be? How does the policy uptake of scientific evidence influence the consolidation of trust?
Thank you, Vivi. It's a pleasure to be here and sharing the stage with you and all the colleagues. Thank you very much. This is indeed a very important topic. We are facing a convergence of crises. We all know that climate change, political polarization, escalating inequality, conflict, armed conflict, deepening problems associated with, for example, climate migration, migration in general, demographic trends, and all these significant challenges demand responses rooted in science. They demand also political will, and they demand trust and collaboration. But the paradox is that while science knowledge has never been more crucial, it's very clear that there's a need for it, but the role in it shaping policy and trust is often precarious. There was a study, recent study by the OECD on the drivers of trust in public institutions, for instance, that reveals that only 44% of people across OECD countries report to trust their national governments. And now, trust in science is a bit higher. In general, people trust science more than their own governments, which might not be too surprising. But even there, it's not uniform. There's data, from a few countries on this, but for example, in the case of the United States, there's a contrast between China, where 90% of people trust scientists, and say the United States, where it's only 55%. Now, there's also an issue of selective trust. In general, the scientific method and the work, the process, the methodologies used in sciences are trusted. But there's a skepticism on the specific topics and on the words and the sayings of scientists. We saw in the last pandemic, this was very striking in the example of vaccines. And vaccines, as we all know, are a very significant success story, and obviously the result of scientific work. But because of misinformation campaigns during the pandemic, vaccine hesitancy, so the people who was already high, the number of people who didn't trust vaccines, well, vaccine hesitancy increased by 8 to 10% globally, according to a study on Nature. And the problem is also exacerbated when senior leaders or political leaders question the validity of science, as occurred in many countries. including my own Mexico, where leaders would often say, well, the easiest thing is to, I don't know, to ask a higher power, to ask God to protect you, and that should be enough. And that obviously diminishes trust in science. It was not the only place where this happened, often with disastrous results in terms of excess deaths and unnecessary problematics, including too many deaths because actions were not taken in time. So, but what drives these skepticisms? And well, misinformation online is clearly a problem. Right now, we live in a world where people are getting most of their information online, and it's very often difficult to distinguish credible sources from misinformation. And social media platforms exacerbate this problem also because the algorithms that drive social media platforms favor sensational news rather than what's often tedious scientific content. Of course, culture and political polarization deepens this skepticism. Again, let me use an example from the USA. I'm not picking on the USA, it's just that there's good data on it. But trust in climate science, for example, is sharply divided along partisan lines. In this report from the Pew Research Center, 22% of Republicans report high trust in climate scientists, 22% compared to 72% of the Democrats. Now, despite these challenges, I think there's reason for hope. There are solutions. A key solution is effective communication. This comes from both parts, from governments and institutions talking about science and the value of science. I mentioned earlier the problem of political leaders not trusting science. So effective communication is there, but also from the scientific community. The scientific community doesn't often know how to explain in simple ways scientific progress, the benefits of science, and does not understand the political context or the questions that society can have. But there are others beyond communication. One is obviously fostering critical thinking, not only through the educational programs, but in general in society. And addressing historical mistrust is essential to ensure that science remains credible in this very increasingly complex world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Gustavo. Our next speaker is Asad Ramzanli. Asad is Special Assistant to the President of the United States of America, President Biden, and Chief of Staff and Deputy Director for Strategy for the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. Asad, in the context of the White House, what have been the typical vehicles or mechanisms used to build trusted advice for decision-making? And what challenges has the US faced in terms of building trust in science?
So thank you for having us, and it's an honor to be with all of you. And thank you for citing the US data. I am a Democrat, so I do believe in climate science. And that's good. President Biden has made a priority of prioritizing science and evidence. Our office, the Office of Science and Technology Policy, which employs a number of climate scientists, he elevated that office to the cabinet rank for the first time ever. In his first week, he issued directives to agencies on evidence and on scientific integrity in how that's used in the policymaking process. So to us, this is key to who we are and our work. I want to play to a few parts of your question there. One, I think about where the trust gap that you were describing in your opening exists. And I think part of it is in communications and in engagement in particular. Certainly the misinformation environment online has something to do with it. Certainly there's a broader media issue and the decline of journalism that can get things to people. But for us in our community, in the scientific community, I want to talk about two communications failure modes that I've seen, and some of it was referenced in the opening this morning, especially as we've seen in the pandemic. One, this phrase that often gets used, trust the science, it almost comes off like religion. It's a preachy, you are on my side or you're not, and I think that's unbelievably harmful. That is not how you convince people of a narrative or of what you have to say. The other failure mode is sometimes we talk in fully formed paragraphs or longer that are scored by footnotes and caveats that lose people. So to your point about communicating the simplicity, I think in any communications field, you have to think about the audience. You have to think about the fit for the purpose that you're getting to. And that middle ground of how do you communicate what you have, what you know, what you need to get across in a way that's credible, that's where we haven't struck that right balance always, especially when the science is most needed, like during a pandemic, like larger crises like the climate. And so the thing that I'd posit is that's where we have to keep figuring out the right balance, but not approach it from a trust the science kind of mentality, because that can be especially off-putting. Now I want to put this in a broader context. I'd posit we have to do this because we're in a moment when we're seeing the erosion of democracy, when we're seeing the erosion of not just our institution, but so many more. And what's happening as we see all this is there's a proliferation of lies, there's a proliferation of misinformation, and that's enabling authoritarianism, that's enabling anti-democratic forces. And many of those people have a promise to fix fabricated threats, fabricated realities. And our job as a scientific community is to communicate in facts and in data and in realities. And so it is our job to think about how to do these things and how to communicate with a society that demands that we do this for the foundations of democracy, for the foundations of what is most important for all of us. And so from where I sit, this is one of the most important things that we should be thinking about, is how do we communicate facts and data and evidence, the values that we all share, so that we can continue to bolster the foundations of society.
Thank you. I have many follow-up questions, but hopefully we'll get to that. I'd like to introduce now Ruth Morgan. Ruth is Professor of Crime and Forensic Science at University College London, founder and director of the UCL Centre for Forensic Sciences, and co-director of the UCL Arista Institute, an initiative between the faculties of engineering, arts, and humanities. Ruth, my question is, what is the role of universities in fostering the type of inter- and transdisciplinary research that lends itself to providing insights for policymakers? And, sorry, two questions. How can we capitalize on the strengths of universities in doing so while recognizing their limitations in this regard?
Well, thank you so much, and wonderful to be here. Thank you so much. Universities are a really special place. I think they have a very unique part to play in society that only universities can do. They have a very unique remit that's different to industry, that's different to business, that's different to government. And they have a huge amount to offer. They also face a lot of challenges. So the Arista Institute that we've set up at UCL is designed very much to try and tackle this very deep problem that universities seem to have, which is that we have this breadth of disciplinary insight and knowledge all in one place, and yet we're not very good at getting the insights that come from that knowledge out to the people who can actually use it and actually implement it to solve challenges. We can do it, but very, very often we're not doing it at the scale and the pace that those challenges demand. So all of these challenges that we're facing right now, where we talk about the term polycrisis, those are all urgent challenges. We can't find solutions in 10 years' time. We need to be finding solutions now. And I think that's been a real struggle within universities. So I think there's a couple of particular pinch points. The first is that time is a really big challenge in universities, both short-term and long-term. So we struggle with the way that infrastructures are and the pressures on university systems now to make time to do that work at the intersections between the disciplines, to invest in exploring those intersections and finding the nuances, the tensions, the resonances that will enable us to ask different kinds of questions, bring different perspectives to challenges, and package that in a way that is engaging and accessible to those who can actually make use of it. I think the second issue that we have is around how we recognise and reward academics in that system. And again, it's a time challenge. We don't recognise the time that it takes to build the relationships that are needed to enable that trust to grow and develop. So it's very, very challenging to demonstrate the impact of the time that you've spent building relationships with those outside of the university. It's not something that's very linear. It's not something that you can necessarily measure, and it's certainly not a short-term situation. So I think that is also a pinch point, but one that is incredibly overcome. We can overcome that one very straightforwardly. We need to think about how we recognise and reward not just the senior academics, which is generally where this work ends up lying because of the aforementioned problem, but also the early career academics. And also we need to be doing it across the disciplines. I think traditionally where this does happen, it's happening in STEM, in science, technology, engineering, but there's so much that we need from the arts and humanities and the social sciences. And that's even more difficult to do because of the way we've structured that knowledge creation and knowledge transfer in those disciplines. So I hope that answers the question to a certain degree, but I feel like I've asked more questions really than I've answered.
Thank you. And I think there'll be time in the Q&A to explore some of those issues. And now let me go on to Patrick Caron. Oh, this way. Patrick is director of the Montpellier Advanced Knowledge Institute on Transitions. He is chair of Agropolis International and vice chair of the SIGAR System Board. SIGAR is the Global Consultative Partnership for International Agricultural Research. Now, Patrick, as a specialist of food systems and also as a veterinarian, I believe, I want to direct this question to you. When it comes to cross-cutting issues such as food security and biosecurity, are there existing structures that work well to bridge the divide between science, society, and policymakers? And what needs to be done better to strengthen the usefulness of scientific developments and, importantly, prevent risk and harms?
Thank you, Vivi, and good morning to all, and great to be here. Bridging the gap and building trust. These are the key words. And to refer to the polycrisis Gustavo talked about, if we, as scientists, limit ourselves to the production and the delivery of technology and evidence, or to the blowing of alerts to call for action, we will fail to address sustainability. We have to address, indeed, what are the pain points. The pain points for transforming the world and to help decision makers, policy makers, to organizing their doubts, to pulling collective intelligence, and in fine, to reach agreements and translate them into actions. Well, it's about trade-offs, we all know about that, but it's much more. It's about past dependency, it's about identifying the risk and cost of change, it's about pathways to anticipate rather than just respond to crisis, just to name a few of those challenges. And what does that mean? First, that means that we have to make knowledge actionable and not just action knowledgeable. Well, it's easy to say, but in fact, the mere transfer of knowledge to decision makers does not necessarily work. And it's not just because policy makers are stupid, would not look up, they are selfish, they just practice blah, blah, blah. No. It's because there is unknown, risk, uncertainty, and because we need collective action and appropriate and fit-for-purpose science policy interface to look at the future and to engage in foresight. Number two, we have to move beyond sectorial silos. I will take the example of food and food security. It's not just transdisciplinarity, it is, of course, but we've seen during the last years and decades a proliferation of expert panels at both the national and the global levels. We've seen that, of course, with climate, but also with biodiversity and ecological services, with food security, now with One Health. They are very well structured. They practice with specific patterns and institutional frameworks under political pressures and tight time frames. And it's quite difficult to bring them together when those crises we are talking about are interconnected, and we need them to work together. Third, we have to move from polarization to controversy. Polarization is about polemics, is about making the one who does not believe the same as me as ridiculous and to try to fight him. On the contrary, controversy means accepting different views, respecting each other, and trying to make something out of divergence and differences. And looking for certainties, we forgot in the past to address doubt and to renew. We need risky, safe space to transform disagreement on disagreement. We don't know even why we disagree, but we fight, into agreement on disagreement, and hopefully to build agreement, moving through negotiation from disagreement on agreement to agreement on agreement. Lastly, we have to open our eyes. A lot is happening on the ground. There are a lot of issues making transformation. If I take the issue of food and food systems and security, if we look at what the metropolitan or urban areas are doing, it's just amazing. Local procurement, quality products, labeling, education. We have to learn from those. We have to learn from each other, learning on a horizontal basis from one to another one, but also learning vertically. That means how to learn from local experiences to draft national policies and global frameworks, or to review them, like, for example, the big elephant in the room, which is about trade organizations. And for all these reasons that I've mentioned, we, the International Science Council, CIRAD, CGR, the University of Montpellier expert panels, civil society organization, government, UN agencies, private sector, we have implemented a process that participants call the Montpellier process just because the first meeting was there. And we explored the opportunity of generating risky, safe space to take risk, to structure learning communities, and to improve the contribution of science and expertise to sustainability. This implies reflection on science policy interface practice. And we share a common vision to creating a connecting tissue across sectors, across scales, across stakeholders, for improving the knowledge ecosystem efficiency. Of course, this needs a paradigm shift in mindset to articulate knowledge, intelligence, and action, and not just transfer, based on shaping and sharing actionable knowledge, intelligence, and action, improving institutional arrangements where dialogue and convergence can take place, and strengthening the capacities of those who have no voice in the dialogue. As a conclusion, of course, science can help and should and must help, but this means business as unusual. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. I'm very happy to welcome our next speaker, Saini Yang. Saini is the Executive Director of Integrated Research on Disaster Risk, sponsored by the ISC, the International Science Council, the United Nations Disaster Risk Reduction. Dr. Yang is a professor at Beijing Normal University. She is the member of the expert committee of the National Disaster Risk Reduction Commission, as well as the expert committee of National Climate Change Adaptation of China and of the Asia Pacific Science and Technology Advisor Group of UNDRR. Saini, decision makers are often weighing inputs in terms of risks and or values for their constituents. Now, what are the primary lessons to be learned from recent regional and global disasters in terms of the cooperation between states in sharing of scientific knowledge and building trust? And in responding, what needs to change to increase preparedness for the future in terms of natural disasters, health emergencies, or catastrophic risks from emerging technologies?
All right, thank you. Thank you, Vivi. It's really an honor to be here. I actually prepared a slide. I'm not sure if I can answer all the questions, but I try to address that in the short time. Yeah, I just want to share some positive. I know that the topic for today is like bridging the gap, but I'm quite optimistic. So I want to share some positive side of this linkage between science and the policy and societal communities. So this is IRDR. IRDR stands for Integrated Research on Disaster Risk, which is an international science plan co-sponsored by IC and UNDRR. And we just started our phase 2, and the vision is really to mobilize science technology towards inclusive, safe, and sustainable development. And of course, for the science plan, we need to improve the knowledge, we need to promote innovation, we need to build institutional capacity. But the important thing I want to address here is, this is like in 2021, ISC and the UNDRR initialized, basically IRDR releases research priority in the new framework. And before our 2024 IRDR international meeting, we sent out an inquiry. We asked all our IRDR community members, hundreds of them, to vote for the most important priority that we want to address. And this is the number 6, I'm sorry, this moved a little bit, which is support regional and national science and knowledge for policy and action. So I'm so grateful to see that. It seems that everybody has this consensus. They know that this is important. They took this as our priority. So, in the past years, for IRDR side, I have witnessed, we have already witnessed so many good collaboration between science and policy. We have the science technology roadmap to support Sendai framework. We have different policy recommendations for regional and national levels. And we generate a series of IRDR policy briefs with ISC and UNDRR. And many of our partners or ICOEs to provide support to local, city level, national level. The reason I want to say that is why in disaster risk field, the interface between science and policy is smooth. I think one important thing is disaster risk is so complicated. The complexity has been well recognized. So in this way, no matter if scientists or policymakers are humble enough, we are humble enough to know that we only know limited facet of a complicated topic. I think this set up a very solid base for communication, for dialogue, and for, interaction, collaboration. So for me, I think this is the number one thing I want to mention. I think it's already, I reached my time. Hopefully Of course, I have some more to say. Yeah, okay, thank you. But talking about the gap, actually from the disaster side, I want to quote my former ED, Rajiv Shah. The challenge not lies in the national level or global level. I think for disaster science, we have enough consensus at the top level. However, the science and the policy linkage at the community level is weak. I think this is something that our community need to work on. So I'll stop here. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Sam. And now we've got time to open questions from the audience. So please, let's get questions. I also encourage the panelists to talk amongst yourselves. A question over there.
Thank you, everyone, for the amazing presentations. Like Dr. Asmat Zidan, Associate Dean of Academic Affairs, College of Public Policy, Qatar Foundation. My question actually is about, like, we know there's erosion of trust and policy of both science and policy. But on the other hand, we have a rise of generative AI and other disruptive technologies. So how can we design innovative tools to not only bridge the gap between science and the policymakers, but also to actively engage citizens in co-creating evidence-informed policies? Like, in simple words, what role can real-time data and AI play in ensuring that decision-making processes remain transparent, inclusive, and adaptive to rapidly evolving societal changes? Thank you.
Thank you. It's a general question. Do any of the speakers want to respond to it?
I'm happy to jump in and start it off. It's a wonderful question, and thank you for asking it. I think the simplistic answer would be we can take, generative AI can be good at taking complicated thoughts, distilling it down, and you could even say, I want to communicate it to this audience in this way for this locality in this language, and it would be good at that. One thing I thought the opening session this morning did well, Dr. Lepton highlighted, it's not just about communication, it's about engagement. Engagement over assertion. That's what generative AI won't necessarily do as well in its current instantiation. Who knows where the technology goes, who knows where the tools go. But I would worry if all we do is say, can you summarize this in this way for this audience, rather than thinking of the two-way dialogue. I very much appreciated, Saini, your point on local versus global. I recently took a trip to Alaska, which in the United States, Alaska's environment, Alaska's economy, its ecology is just so different than the rest of the than the lower 48 states. And seeing how the local communities were dealing with things was such a learning moment for me and for my colleagues. But that doesn't happen if all we think to do is, I need to communicate this same message in a new way, maybe. And so that's one thought I have. While we're on the topic of AI, one other thing I'll add there is the ability of AI, and here I don't just mean large language models or generative AI, but more broadly, to transform science is something that is really, really exciting. But I think we have to think about what enables that. Federal or public investments in research needs to continue in that domain because there's so much that can happen. But I fear that if all we have is corporate investment, we won't get some of the benefits that can come out of what does it mean when you take all of the telescope data that Europeans, that Americans, that the Chinese, that so many are collecting and try to make sense of it using AI? That won't happen in a corporate setting. So that's one plea I'll put out there.
Thank you. Ruth?
Yeah, I just thought thank you. I think that's a really good point, that with AI, it's actually quite unprecedented that a lot of technological capabilities that have emerged and changed the way we do science and changed the way we do society have come from the university setting in the past, and AI is one where actually it's now happening in the corporate setting, which has a whole different set of values, drivers, needs, requirements. And I think that's something that I think we need to be having a conversation about as a broader society, because the kinds of outputs that are going to come from a development in that setting are going to be different to the ones that we're used to. And if we think about the role that, as you were just saying about how AI is able to very quickly, very effectively summarize, but it's not about engagement is about people to people. So I often think about science can't be separated from the scientists, societal challenges can't be separated from communities. So AI, I think, is going to be a really valuable tool in our toolkit, but I would be very, very concerned if we felt that it was going to eliminate the role of humans, relationships, and conversation that helps us move forward collectively.
So all the panel want to respond to that question. I'll give it over to Gustavo.
Thank you. No, I think it is indeed a very important question. One way that we have approached this through at UNESCO is the recommendation on the ethics of AI, precisely to try to make sure that this technology that has humongous potential, very high potential, also poses very strong challenges, ethical questions. And we produced a recommendation that was endorsed by 194 member states, and now is in the process of being implemented. We have what we call the readiness assessment methodologies with 60 countries to be able to adapt their science ecosystems, their policies, their legislation, to make sure they comply with the recommendations. And this is not just important for AI, also there are new and emerging technologies, all things to do with neuro, and it's key, to make sure, especially because we have all this, you've mentioned the concentration of research on a few, especially corporations, not any more traditional ways, but it's not the problem that it's corporations that are just very few and very highly concentrated, in particular in 2 countries. And indeed, you have to take into account the implications, the ethical, the social implications of these technologies. Thank you.
Patrick?
Yes, thank you. Well, this is a critical question. Thank you very much. The modern technologies do have an increasing power to transform the world. And sometimes there is the assumption that any technological advance will necessarily contribute to innovation, that will necessarily contribute to the well-being of the humanity. But we know it's not true. And the science, or it's not true in all conditions. And the role of science, therefore, is twofold. Number one is to have a critical eye as a public good to understand under which conditions technological advance can or not contribute to the so-called progress or to the sustainability development. And the number two role of public science is to enlighten what we can call socio-technical controversy. That is, what are the different views and the different vested interests in that? Not to substitute to policy decision-making, but to enlighten the decision for informed decisions to be taken. So that's a critical role of science if we want to build trust and not just be blind about technological advance.
May I? I'll try to get my comments very short. I want to give a very concrete example of how to use AI, new technologies in disaster risk, early warning for all. Early warning information. Right now we're talking about impact-based early warning, not only the hazard-based, right? So that we want impact-based? Because we want everyone has accessibility, everyone can understand, and they will have the feel, right? Then they can start with anticipatory actions. And in this process, this is a very typical positive side is we are using new technologies, we are using big data, we are using big models. Another side is we are using this crowdsourced information, and we collect information from the users, and then we know that in which area, what kind of materials is needed, something that can help them. This is the positive side. And I think this side also help with social transformation, because people have the feeling of engagement.
they participate in this process and they feel they contribute to the cope of disaster risk. But the negative side is usually only the location or say region with higher economic development, they have the accessibility. They will be able to use intelligent form, right, to give the feedback, to receive the signal, and only the rich area can afford to use big data, big model to process this early warning information. So for this example, I see two sides. The good side is, yes, it has been widely used, it's helped with the social transformation, but on the other side, this new technology is exaggerated the regional variation. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Technological divides globally. Other questions from the floor, here in front.
Thank you very much. So if there is a gap, and in terms of the gap, but you just explained your approach as scientist, a representative of science, but both sides are responsible if the situation is worsening or improving. How you see the institutional approach to improve the cooperation, avoiding the decreasing worsening situation from the point of the science, how to improve the cooperation in an institutional manner between the scientific community and in the wide sense, the decision-making or policy-making community. Because usually the vision, the horizon of the two communities very much different. Scientists typically have a longer-term one. Policymakers, for various reasons, let not be explained, typically have a shorter-term one. And there are also competitions between the various interests, goals, social, economic, environmental. So what you offer, how to improve the communication, a better understanding on the interdependence of the two sides. So I guess you understand my approach. I would not be very critical, but I'm very much interested how you see how the situation can be improved, a better acceptance of sometimes a little bit uncertain scientific advice. Thank you.
Thank you. Patrick, your hand is up first.
Thank you. Well, just an anecdote. When I began to work on science policy interface, I remember one of my friends and colleagues referring to the tango. He was coming from Latin America, from the south of Latin America, and he was looking at the best way for the two dancers to understand each other and to design a very nice type of performance. Well, the more I go into it, the more I see it's not a tango. It's much more than just policymakers and scientists. It's a quite complex ecosystem where knowledge is at the heart and how knowledge is not just transferred with different paradigm, backgrounds, and epistemologies and objectives, time, long, short. But it's also how to design knowledge together and how to shape the learning process, bringing all constituencies on board. So it's not just a transfer of knowledge, it's how to build intelligence and how to shape institutional spaces for doing that. That means spaces where we can learn from each other, where we can learn from failures, where we can look at what we have in front of our eyes to improve it and to design and improve the action. And of course, this goes through, first of all, respect and try to understand each other.
Etiquette, gosh. I think that's an incredibly powerful question that really gets to very much the heart of it. From a university perspective, I think we're seeing some really promising signs that there is a real understanding that we need to move from an ivory tower to having far more porous boundaries. And when you talk about this in universities, it can be quite tricky to navigate. I often use a metaphor from the ecosystem space, which is traditionally, in universities, we have favoured an approach that is like a field of wheat. So a single crop, nice, neat, straight lines, very efficient, very dense. You might bring in something to help you around the edges, but broadly speaking, we solve problems with single disciplinary approaches, very dense, very efficient, very process-driven. And there's an awful lot of challenges which that works for brilliantly, which is why it's become a thing. But what we're seeing now is, with the complexity that is very, very evident in a lot of the challenges that are coming our way, that there are lots of challenges where that doesn't work. And so actually we need to move from being a field of wheat to being a meadow that has hundreds of different plants and flowers, all the different stages of growth. It requires the right environment, it requires the right amount of light and water, but it also requires a critical part of that ecosystem to thrive, which is a bee. So a bee that travels from plant to plant, cross-pollinating, and enabling that environment to thrive. And I think that's been a very powerful message within the universities, that actually the meadow is not the university, the meadow is society, and that our role as scientists within the university has to be seeing where we can enable and create opportunities for bees to travel from plant to plant, gaining knowledge and gaining insight, building trust, building relationships and networks, so that actually both sides understand the challenges that each side is dealing with. And I very much like that. We're not playing the tango, dancing the tango. This is not just a them and us thing. This is a collective. We need to work together. And if we think of it as bees in a meadow, we're getting a little bit closer.
Thank you, Ruth. Well, Gustavo, and then Saini.
Thank you. Yes, indeed, I agree. It's a powerful question. Now, I'm going to say a few points. One, common thread along this conversation has been the relevance of communication and the importance of, I think it's particularly relevant that scientific community be able to communicate the relevance of science, the relevance of the research to the public in general, but communication goes both ways. So that's also important that you know, the rest of society is able to communicate to science and scientific researchers what is needed. And this is my second point, which refers to awareness. I'm struck, at some point I was part of a research center in a university, and I led the policy unit, and the rest was, you know, natural sciences and all. And to me, the lack of awareness, for instance, of the public issues among the scientists was really surprising. And when you would talk to them, you say, that, you know, it was like suddenly awakening of things. So that's why I say, you know, communication goes both ways, but it's awareness and of the social implications, the social challenges, so that scientific research can address them better. I'll give you an example of something we're working on at the Management of Social Transformations program at UNESCO, which precisely looks at the science policy nexus. We're examining the effect of the fair climate transition, how to ensure that the climate transition is fair. And here you have an issue that we have very good solutions that climate scientists have developed with the assistance of others like economists and lawyers and so on. But very often they focus on the problem, the climate issue being addressed. Like, we have to reduce the use of fossil fuels. Oh, well, maybe we'll put a tax or regulate the amount of fossil fuels that can be used. Yes, that's very fine, but this has very big social implications. And the social costs are not borne equally across society. So if you don't look at that part as well, you're probably even defeating the expected results of the climate policies, because you will have opposition, social opposition, some of these measures, if you're not complementing that with social and economic programs to compensate those most affected in some ways. So you have to have all this general awareness of things to make sure that the results of scientific research guiding policy are well taken into account. Also, related to this is the issue of understanding. It goes even to the level of training at the universities, in academia, on the fact that, you know, we have a growing tendency for hyper-specialization, and of course that's needed. You need hyper-specialization to be able to do things like come up with vaccines against COVID in a very short time. But at the same time, this hyper-specialization often blinds to other issues. We need interdisciplinarity, transdisciplinarity, but also the awareness of social challenges I was talking about among scientific community. Just 2 more points very quickly. One thing that the ISC, especially Peter Gluckman, has been always advocating is the role of scientific advisory bodies in government. I think that's an important thing. We have to find the best practice, what really works there. And finally, the role of international organizations, international efforts. The World Science Forum is an example. The recommendations on science and scientific researchers on open science, on the ethics of AI that have been championed by UNESCO, and other work by other organizations, also very important to make sure that, you know, all this idea permeates through all countries. Thank you.
Thank you. Saini.
Thank you. I just want to add 2 more points. The first one is mutual respect. I think this is very important. I have worked with the decision maker at different levels, community, city level, provincial, national level, or UN. I have a lot of respect for those decision makers. I think as a scientist, we usually are good with depth. But for policymakers, they are very good with width. Sometimes they cannot express their models, right? They cannot provide you a conceptual model or some quantitative analysis, but they have this high dimension problem in their minds. So this, I respect them a lot for decision makers. And of course, I think because we are neutral, we have the depth, the policymakers have respect for us. I think this mutual respect is the #1 thing to bridging the gap. The second one is the autocatalysis. Yesterday in the opening ceremony, the researcher introduced this autocatalysis. I think that's really interesting idea, because I observed this in this interaction of science and policy interaction. So at least for a scientist, I think in this process, we have at least 3 roles. We are observer. We observe the implementation. We observe the reality, right? Then we are arbitrator. We help to choose which approach to take. Then sometimes we become an advocator. I want to pro on some kind of policies. Then again, we go for observer. So in this loop, for me, it just sounds like an autocatalysis for me. I think in this process, I very much agree with Asa that trust in science, I don't think that's a good term. Where basically this is a co-development. So both sides, if we can take this approach, I think the future will be more promising. Thank you.
Thank you. There's a question here in front. Excuse me, Virginia Murray, and then we'll go there.
Thank you so much. What a wonderful discussion. My name is Virginia Murray. I work for the UK Health Security Agency and link closely to the International Science Council and have for IRDR. Wonderful to see you here, Sani. Welcome to your new job. A great discussion, but I really wanted to try and link to Ruth's wonderful comment about bees in a meadow. I think we are bees in a meadow that have to work together. I think that's a great idea, possibly easier than the tango for me. But I was wondering, Gustavo, if we shouldn't celebrate the fact that UNESCO has been incredible. Working with CoData and the International Science Council, we have just launched for consultation data policies in times of crisis, facilitated by Open Science. It's a toolkit that is out for everybody to comment on and review, and the process that UNESCO has developed for this about trying to encourage every person in this room to be a bee in Ruth's meadow, to try and improve our ability to bring data in times of crisis to much more accessible to support some of Sani's thoughts. Is this a model we could use more? Is there something we should be celebrating? Is it a process that we as scientists can bring to work with our UN and UN member state partners more easily and to link to our policymakers? Vivi, I'd love a thought.
Well, thank you very much. Actually, that's I appreciate the comment, and I agree that it's a good metaphor to think about the bees in the meadow. And yes, I mean these are the type of efforts that we should continue to uphold. I think this is a process where we'll be learning along the way, and we'll always be coming up with new ways of solving this. So I appreciate your work. We have to address this through different angles, the research, the data gathering, the recommendations. So, well, thank you. I don't have anything to add to that, but thank you very much.
And we have a question over there.
I'm Amal Amin, professor at National Research Center from Egypt. I have a comment, not a question. According to the previous question, at first we have to change the mindsets about what's the meaning of scientist. Because scientist is not only a knowledge producer. As example, one scientist from developing country expected to produce a certain number of papers per each year. So that, and I'm controlled by numbers also with H-index and so on. And also we are inside my institute controlled by the number of ranking of the institute itself. So that we have to change the mindset about what's the meaning of scientist. Scientist is change maker, not knowledge producer or papers producer. When we change that, so that we have to change the total system. We have to build a system from bottom up, from the scientists, from the society, inclusive, multidisciplinary system, include private sector. Where is the private sector here in this forum? No one from industry. We have to listen to the private sector, to the industry, to the people themselves, because now there is science for people. We have to begin from bottom. And also for funding, always topics, always pre-prepared topics. Pre-prepared topics. But we have to own our topics. We have to be listened as scientists. No actual freedom for scientists. We have to work under certain topics. If we want financial support or something like that, why all of us should work on water, food, energy? We want to work on our own topics related to the society. Always, if we look to Nobel Prize this year, most of it practical. But in some countries and in some institutes, we couldn't work like that. We have strategy. So that if we will let the scientists to work according to the society, so that we will have really inclusive scientist. I refuse trust in science because I am founder of several global organizations like Global Young Academy and New Society. It's called Science for Humanity. I found all respect from policymakers, all support, but the problem is a misunderstanding between us. We have gap between us. We need a little bit of communication between us. But communication, me only who make communication inside my institutes or two more, because they have no time. They are controlled by regulations, by promotions, by certain factors to be prominent scientists. That's why they have to be member in certain organizations. They have to have certain funding and so on. So that at least we have to begin to build this new system. New bottom-up system, not up-bottom. Up means policy. We create the policy and all of us must follow. We have to stop that. Thanks.
Thank you. So an interesting question. Challenging the role of a scientist in a way. I'll pick up an element of what you said. The scientist is change maker. And if we look at the scientist as change maker, putting on that hat, that role, how would that change the balance in a way, or the dynamics, not the balance, the dynamics of the policy, society, science dialogue? Put that to the speakers, maybe. Assad.
I loved what you had to say, so thank you for that, and thank you for especially saying the role is to reflect what the people need, what society needs. I often think science doesn't have one role, it has many. One of those roles is to further knowledge in and of itself, but we often overlook the things you were talking about of what is the need of people. And one way we try to think about it is, what are the aspirations of our time? Because the beauty of science, in my view, is that we as a scientific community get to build the future. We get to think about where things are going and help build that for society. And that only matters if you can start from what's the need. How do we understand where we need to go? So I appreciated you saying that very much. And I do think that there's what's the role of scientists in society, but also what's the role of society in informing the science that gets done?
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, a very quick reaction. I think that has been quite well addressed in the plenary session just before. It's not just about the scientist, it's also about science and its institutions. So it's not just an individual type of responsibility. Our institutions have a huge role in identifying the mission, the vision, the mission, the practice, the way to evaluate the scientist, and not just on the production of knowledge, if it's the case, but on very different criteria and angles. And that was very well addressed in the plenary session, not looking in that session uniquely or only at the role of scientists, but at the role of science and how to shape the institutions in that direction.
Saini?
Thank you. I really like this question because as a professor, I totally understand what you're talking about. Yes, I was driven by numbers as well. But I want to say that if we define scientists as change maker, then the question will be, who are not change maker? What makes scientists special or slightly different from the other groups? I think it is the neutrality. I think the neutrality is something that is very special for this scientist group. Yes, of course, we want to make a change, but when we are working as observer, we really need to take this neutrality position to observe that. As an arbitrator, the same thing. I'm not certainly support certain type of technology or certain, some groups' results. So I think I understand. I think it's very important that it's time for us to make a change in the university system, in the evaluation system, that the impact of our work should be at a higher position, not just numbers. But again, I think for scientist group, it's always important to keep this neutrality in our mind. Thank you.
Gustavo, and then we'll move to concluding statements.
Thank you. No, I agree. This was a very interesting comment and question on the relevance of scientists as change makers. I agree that there are biases in the way we evaluate, there are problems in the way we evaluate scientific advancement and research, but you still need some good criteria, more neutral to make sure that you maintain robustness and rigor of scientific research. But I agree, we have to think of a better system. We also have to make sure that it's open. There's a lot of open source, that scientific advancement is not limited to a few. And this also refers to the big social problems. For instance, in health, there's a lot of research by universities, by pharmaceutical companies on diseases that affect precisely more the global north, but some diseases that may affect millions of people, but it's not seen as very profitable, don't get the same amount of time and effort in research to solve them, perhaps because the payoff doesn't look so good. So we need to change also the mindset to address these societal challenges, a bit delinking them from the potential monetary benefits. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to the very thoughtful questions. And now I'd like to go through the panel and ask you in really not more than half a minute a key takeaway message from this session, and maybe, from the last 2 days. So who would like to start? Patrick.
Yes, well, we talk about trust, we talk about crisis, and I will not minimize that. We recently published an article after a conference on what's the role of science in time of crisis in PLOS. But it's not just about crisis. It's about also anticipating the future, preparing the future, be proactive and not just reactive. If we want to talk about trust, and that means shaping. I'll repeat myself, but I think it's important, shaping knowledge ecosystem that make it possible to anticipate and to look at the future. It's the only way that we can bridge the gap and build trust.
You're too courteous, we don't move.
Thanks, Vivi. Thank you, Sani. I think Professor Amin's point is incredibly poignant, and I think that was reflected in all of the responses. I think my takeaway point, if I may, is that one of the things we have to do as scientists is get much, much better at being able to communicate what kinds of questions science can answer, what kinds of questions science can't answer. And that is part of the dialogue that has to happen collectively. And to the point of being change makers, my personal view is that we cannot make change in silos. We have to make change collectively. And that often means incorporating voices from places that you might not expect. I'm particularly interested in this transition that we've seen, particularly in the UK, of not using single-use plastic bags. That was a policy change, but why was it successful? Many people would argue it's because people like David Attenborough created beautiful documentary stories that were beamed into people's living rooms over decades that showed the issues of plastics in the oceans, and that led in part to the change alongside the policy. So we need to think very, very collectively about how we make change, and I think we do it together.
Thank you. Asa.
I think it'd be hard to walk away from this in summarizing without talking about bees in a meadow. And a metaphor is only good when it goes too far, so let me try that. There are bees in a meadow, but there are also butterflies and there are also wasps and so many other types of animals and field mice. And I think what that means for us here is not just the communications and trust gaps that we've been talking about, but realizing that this isn't a conversation between scientists and policymakers. It is a conversation between policymakers and scientists and economists and people in the military and the private sector and so many other domains. And it's not, I want to make sure we don't fall into the arrogant trap of, but if only people heard us. Because there is a vivid conversation happening, and policy, the job of policy, the job of politics, the word derives from polity, the people. It is supposed to reflect the issues of the people at any given time. And so I think about the role of science as not being the top most important thing, but being subservient to and being enabled by the things that allow for good science to happen. And at the most fundamental level, I think about things like human rights and the rule of law and an orderly society that allows for these things, and people who have enough food so that they can ask scientific questions. So to me, I want to put that in that context of how do we make sure that our questions are not just one-on-one dialogues that don't actually exist, but actually exist in a loud din that we find ourselves in.
Gustavo.
Well, thank you. No, I just want to celebrate the fact that we are discussing this science and policy interface at the time of global transformation. It's really, really very important, the fact that we're having this discussion. I agree with you, we have to go beyond and not stay. I hope they can hear us, but we have to move with the messages. There's a vibrant discussion here, and there's a lot to be done. So basically, I'm glad that the World Science Forum is doing this. Thank you.
Same.
Yeah, I only have 2 words. I think it's hope. Yeah, hope. If we have hope, we can be proactive. And the second one, I think the word is just open your mind. Open your mind. Give up the arrogance of traditional outsmart someone's arrogance and open the mind and be more engaged in social transformation. Thank you.
So to conclude, my key takeaway message is, in the spirit of positivity and humility, making connections and building trust across multiple stakeholders and audiences with different allegiances, different knowledge systems, different belief systems, is a most delicate and difficult task, and one that is central to the place of science in the 21st century. So thank you very much. Thank you to our speakers and to the wonderful questions. Thank you.